The morning of December 4th, 2024, brought to Midtown Manhattan a species of violence that was both shocking in its brazenness and revelatory in its symbolism. Brian Thompson, chief executive of United Healthcare, that vast apparatus of actuarial calculation and human suffering, was gunned down outside the Hilton Hotel on 6th Avenue, steps away from where he was to address an investor conference. The assassin, whose methodical execution and subsequent escape spoke to considerable premeditation, left behind shell casings inscribed with the words "deny," "defend," and "depose," a mordant reference to the insurance industry's notorious tactics for avoiding payment of claims. One must begin by stating the obvious, though in our current degraded discourse it apparently needs stating: murder is wrong. The taking of human life outside the boundaries of law represents a fundamental breach of the social contract that binds civilized society. Thompson was a husband, a father, a human being whose life was extinguished in an act of calculated violence that no amount of corporate malfeasance could possibly justify. To suggest otherwise is to embrace the logic of the lynch mob, the revolutionary tribunal, the midnight knock on the door, all those instruments of arbitrary justice that civilization exists to supersede. And yet, and here one treads carefully but necessarily, the response to this killing revealed something profoundly disturbing about the American condition. Across social media platforms, in comment sections, in private conversations, there emerged not the universal condemnation one might expect, but something far more troubling. A sense of grim satisfaction, even celebration, from those who saw in Thompson not a human being, but the embodiment of a system that had caused them or their loved ones immeasurable suffering. This was not merely the usual rabble delighting in the misfortune of the mighty. This was something deeper, more systemic, more ominous. The American healthcare system, of which United Healthcare represents perhaps the most profitable exemplar, stands as a monument to market failure and moral abdication. Here is an industry that has perfected the art of extracting wealth from human misery, that has transformed the Hippocratic Oath into a shareholder's report, that has made an algorithm of denial into the cornerstone of its business model. The company that Thompson helmed reported revenues of $371 billion in 2023, while simultaneously maintaining one of the highest claim denial rates in the industry. These are not merely statistics, they represent countless individual tragedies, families bankrupted by medical bills, treatments delayed until they became futile, medications rationed by those who could not afford their full prescriptions. Consider the perversity of the system. In what other advanced nation would a diagnosis of cancer prompt not only existential dread but financial terror? Where else would diabetics ration insulin, that miracle of modern medicine discovered over a century ago, because market forces have priced it beyond their means? Where else would citizens organize online to share strategies for navigating Byzantine insurance bureaucracies, as if planning a military campaign against an occupying force? The answer, of course, is nowhere, at least nowhere that claims to be civilized. The inscriptions on those shell casings, deny, defend, depose, reference a phrase familiar to anyone who has wrestled with health insurance claims. Delay, deny, defend has become the unofficial motto of an industry that has perfected the art of attrition, wearing down claimants through endless appeals, requirements for prior authorization, and arbitrary coverage limitations. That someone would transform this phrase into an epitaph represents a kind of poetic justice so laden with irony that it would be literary if it weren't lethal. But here we must pause and consider what this moment represents in the broader American narrative. The United States, that great experiment in democratic capitalism, has always struggled with the tension between individual liberty and collective responsibility. The healthcare debate embodies this tension in its most acute form. On one side stand those who view healthcare as a commodity, subject to market forces and consumer choice. Never mind that no one chooses to have cancer, that medical emergencies respect neither scheduling nor solvency. On the other stand, those who view healthcare as a human right, a fundamental requirement for the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that the founding documents promise. The murder of Thompson represents, in its brutal way, the breakdown of this debate into something more primitive. When institutional channels fail, when democratic processes are captured by corporate interests, when suffering becomes institutionalized and profits privatized, violence begins to seem, to some, like the only remaining form of expression. This is not to excuse such violence, it remains inexcusable, but to recognize it as a symptom of societal failure on a grand scale. One thinks of Bertolt Brecht's question, what is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank? In our current context, we might ask, what is the murder of a healthcare executive compared to the systematic denial of healthcare to millions? The answer, morally speaking, is clear. Murder remains murder, wrong remains wrong. But the question itself reveals the moral confusion that corporate capitalism has engendered, where violence done with spreadsheets and algorithms seems somehow less real than violence done with bullets. The parallels to previous moments of American violence are instructive. The assassination of William McKinley by Leon Czolgosz in 1901 came at the height of the Gilded Age, when inequality had reached levels that would not be seen again until our own time. The anarchist Czolgosz saw in McKinley the representative of a system that ground down the poor while enriching the few. His act of violence solved nothing, changed nothing, except to demonstrate the depths of rage that inequality can engender. Similarly, the violence of the 1960s and 1970s, the Weather Underground, the Symbionese Liberation Army, emerged from a sense that conventional politics had failed to address fundamental injustices. These movements too accomplished nothing but to demonstrate the bankruptcy of violence as a political tool. And yet, the conditions that create such violence persist, and in many ways have worsened. The concentration of wealth in America today exceeds that of the Gilded Age. The mechanisms by which this wealth is extracted have become more sophisticated, more legalized, more systematized. The health insurance industry represents perhaps the perfect synthesis of this extraction. A system that profits from denying the very service it purports to provide, that has inserted itself as a parasitic intermediary between doctor and patient, that has transformed medical decisions into financial calculations. Thompson himself was, by all accounts, a capable executive who had risen through the ranks of United Health Group over 2 decades. His compensation in 2023 was reported to be over $10 million, a sum that would seem obscene in any context, but appears particularly so when one considers that it was earned by overseeing a system that regularly denies coverage for life-saving treatments. This is not personal animus against Thompson the man, but rather recognition of what he represented: the banalization of cruelty, the corporatization of suffering, the reduction of human health to a line item on a balance sheet. The shooter, whose identity remained unknown at the time of this writing, has become something of a folk hero in certain corners of the internet, a development that should alarm anyone who values civil society. The romanticization of violence, even violence directed against unsympathetic targets, represents a dangerous turn toward nihilism. History teaches us that once violence becomes normalized as a political tool, it rarely remains confined to its original targets. The French Revolution, that great cautionary tale of justified rage turned murderous, began with the execution of aristocrats and ended with the revolutionaries executing each other. Yet the conditions that created this moment of violence show no signs of abating. The American healthcare system continues its predatory practices unabated. The political system, captured by corporate money and paralyzed by partisan division, appears incapable of meaningful reform. The COVID-19 pandemic, which might have served as a catalyst for change, instead reinforced existing inequalities and enriched the very corporations that perpetuate them. United Health Group's stock price, after a brief dip following Thompson's murder, quickly recovered. The market's cold calculation that one executive's death changes nothing fundamental about the business model. What then is to be done? The answer cannot be violence. That way lies only chaos and further suffering. But neither can it be acquiescence to a system that treats human health as a profit center. The solution, if there is one, must be political, must be democratic, must involve the fundamental restructuring of how Americans think about healthcare. Every other developed nation has solved this problem, has recognized that certain goods, health, education, basic security, cannot be left entirely to market forces without corrupting both the market and the society it supposedly serves. The tragedy of Brian Thompson's death is not merely that a human life was lost, but that it was lost in service to a system that nobody, not its executives, not its shareholders, not its victims, truly believes in. It is a system maintained by inertia, by concentrated interests, by the failure of imagination that characterizes so much of American life. Thompson's killer, whoever they are, apparently believed that violence could break this inertia. They were wrong. Violence begets only violence, chaos only chaos. But the rage that motivated this killing, the rage that has met it with sympathy rather than revulsion, that rage is real and will not dissipate simply because we wish it away. It is the rage of the cancer patient denied treatment, the diabetic rationing insulin, the family choosing between medication and rent. It is a rage that, if not channeled into constructive political action, will find other darker expressions. The shell casings left at the scene, deny, defend, depose, read like a grim haiku of corporate America. But they also read like a warning, a signal that the social contract that holds civilization together is fraying. When citizens begin to see violence as the only remedy to systemic injustice, when murder is met with memes rather than mourning, when a corporate executive's death becomes occasion for celebration rather than reflection, we have entered dangerous territory indeed. The question before us is not whether Brian Thompson deserved to die, he did not, but whether the system he represented deserves to survive. That system, which transforms human suffering into shareholder value, which has made medical bankruptcy the leading cause of personal financial ruin in America, which treats health as a privilege rather than a right, that system is already violent. Its violence is simply distributed, bureaucratized, made invisible by forms and procedures and algorithms. Thompson's murder made that violence visible, reflected it back in a form that cannot be ignored or rationalized. We stand at a crossroads. We can continue down the current path, where healthcare remains a grotesque parody of market capitalism, where violence becomes increasingly seen as the only form of political expression available to the powerless. Or we can recognize this moment for what it is, a warning that systemic injustice, left unaddressed, will eventually explode into actual violence. The choice is ours, but time is running short. The next shooting, the next tragedy, the next explosion of rage is always just around the corner in a society that has confused profit with purpose, that has mistaken cruelty for efficiency, that has forgotten that the measure of civilization is how it treats its most vulnerable members. Brian Thompson is dead, killed by an assassin who believed that murder could make a political point. The assassin was wrong about the solution, but not about the problem. The problem remains, vast and systematic and cruel. Until we address it through democratic means, through political action, through the hard work of reform, we will continue to see violence erupt from the margins, continue to see rage manifest in bullets rather than ballots. This is not a justification but a prediction, not an endorsement but a warning. The question is whether we will heed it.